So we're now going to start by handing over. So firstly, replacing Imogen Sean as Speakers Officer, Oliver Jackson. Go. And replacing Lucy Lassman as Social Events Officer, Jonathan Carr. And not quite replacing Emily Gittins as Executive Officer, incoming Treasurer Michael Dunn. And although not technically now, in about 2 weeks' time, replacing Alex Rosani as Vice President, Alex Porter. And finally, to my successor, Joanna Mobed. Best of luck. You'll be great.
Thank you, Joel, and congratulations for a fantastic term. In a slightly sort of new convention, we're going to have Alex Rosani, the Vice President, chair this week's debate. Alex has been Vice President for the past calendar year, and we'd like to welcome him to chair Joel's presidential.
Right, well, thank you, Joanna, and thank you, I just think, on behalf of the union, to Joel for putting on what has been and what continues to be a fantastic term. Obviously, because we have two speakers remaining, Lisa Kudrow and Neil Gaiman, on Saturday. The motion for this House tonight is this House believes that a two-state solution is the only solution. Speaking in favour of the motion in first proposition is Joel Fenster. Joel is obviously the outgoing president of the Cambridge Union, for those of you who hadn't guessed. He is a second-year PPS student at Selwyn College. Joel.
Thank you. I'm sure you're all fed up of hearing about the union tonight rather than the topic that we're here to discuss. But if there's anything that this union is about, it's about debating. And it's about debating the issues that aren't always popular. It's about hearing the opinions that you don't always hear. And it's not just about speaking amongst those who agree. And that point has really been hammered home for me in recent weeks, when I decided that we should hold this debate on Israel-Palestine. They say in America that social security is the third rail of American politics. You touch it and you die. When it comes to planning debates, it's certainly Israel-Palestine, I can tell you. The moment you decide to start organizing it, members of the left, members of the right, members of the center will all warn you. At the end of the day, you'll be hated by every side. I never knew quite how right they were until I started planning this debate. It's not an easy topic, and it's certainly not easy in order to have every perspective represented fairly in a debate. And I have to concede, and I really wouldn't want anyone to leave this room thinking that there is not overwhelming support for the two-state solution amongst Israelis and amongst Palestinians. And if that's not fully reflected in this debate, I can only apologize. You'll also have to forgive me. My last exam was about 8 hours ago. So if my speech isn't too well researched, please forgive me. But about 2 months ago, we had the Israeli ambassador standing here in this chamber, speaking about the need for a two-state solution. A month ago, we had the Palestinian ambassador speaking about the need for a two-state solution. They didn't agree on how to get there. They didn't agree on why we hadn't yet achieved it. But they both felt that that was the only position that would fully answer the cries of their people. And they both felt that it was only through the two-state solution that both Israelis and Palestinians could reach the goal of self-determination. And the argument I'm going to advance tonight, and I hope that that's true across the board, is not a historical one. I'm not going to talk about who was where when. If we go back throughout history over the past 1,000 years, you will find Jews living there, you will find Palestinians living there, you'll find them living there together, you'll find them living there separately, you will find various groups kicking each other out. Because I don't believe that that's beneficial, because no one's going anywhere. We can have a debate about the moral high ground. I got an email a few months ago pointing out where in the Quran it speaks about Jerusalem and where in the Old Testament it speaks about Jerusalem, as though somehow this was going to advance the situation in the slightest, as though winning the moral high ground was the way to handle this debate. Because no one's going anywhere. That's the reality. And the reality of this debate is that what we need right now is a solution that's going to help both Israelis and both Palestinians. And I don't say that they've both faced injustices throughout history, because that's the politically correct thing to say at the start of a debate, and it makes me sound nice and balanced. I say it because that's the reality, and I say it because that is why the one-state solution will not work. The two-state solution, I think everyone here probably knows, is about returning to the 1967 borders, the Green Line, creating an independent state of Israel and an independent state of Palestine living alongside each other. And for most people who engage on this issue, it's about having East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem, each as the capital to their own respective sovereign state. And we can go into the impediments that lead to that, and we can discuss why it is that that hasn't yet been achieved. But at the end of the day, it's the goal that we're here to debate tonight, and that's what I really hope remains the center of this debate. We can talk about colonial injustices throughout history. If we do that, we're going to redraw the border of almost every country. Or we can focus on how it is that we're going to address the situation, and I firmly believe that that is only through the two-states solution. But there's a brutal fact at the center of that, and it's not something that we like to admit, and it's not something that's often talked about, and that is that both nations, both Israelis and Palestinians, have a need for a state of their own. We like to think we live in a post-religious world, we like to think we live in a post-nationalist world, and the idea of determining a state based on ethnicity sounds absolutely abhorrent to all of us. And the idea that we would divide it up based on two peoples because they couldn't possibly live together, it doesn't sound like an ideal solution. But what we have to recognize is that for both of these peoples, who have been persecuted throughout history, for both who have tried being minorities in other states, and both who have faced injustice as a result, it is only going to be through self-determination, only through a state of their own, only through being able to control their own destiny that they can feel fully secure, and not just for those living in the state. When Jews in Ethiopia were being persecuted, it was Israeli helicopters that went in to rescue them. And Palestinians too need to know that when they are persecuted around the world, that they will be rescued by a state that is there to represent their interests. This isn't in any sense an argument for a state that only admits one of these two nationalities, but it is why I firmly believe that a single state, there for both Palestinians and Israelis, which pretends that there aren't these tensions, which pretends that fear isn't what's dominant in this situation, is not only impracticable, but it is also idealist to the point of not working. And I'd also remind you all, no one here is looking for love. No one here is looking for everyone to hold hands and sing Kumbaya. This isn't about how we're all going to get on. This is about practicable peace. This is about a solution that's going to work, because the current situation is intolerable. For the Palestinians, in their day-to-day lives, the current situation cannot stand. For Israelis, particularly those living in the border areas who face thousands of missiles and rockets every year, the current situation cannot stand. And that is why we need two states, and that is why it is the only solution that will work. Not because it's the ideal solution, not because it's something we would all want, not because anyone wants to speak about nationalism as the foundation for any state, but because it's the reality of the region. And that's because of the centrality of fear. For the people who live in Israel and who live in the West Bank and Gaza, the fear of their neighbors is constant. And whilst it might be nice, as I've said, to have a single state, a single secular state constitutionally bound to not favor either people, to say to Palestinians that you have to live as a minority in a new state doesn't sound like a solution to their problems. And to say to Israelis, who within 15 years would almost certainly be a minority in the new state, they too won't feel secure with that solution. And it's that fear that runs throughout the Middle East, particularly in these two groups of individuals, both the Palestinians and the Israelis, that means that the one-state solution simply will not work. Because the trust that you need in order to agree to form a state together, but also to agree that the constitution as you set it out, the secular constitution as you set it out, is going to be there forever. Because whilst mainstream Palestinians and mainstream Israelis might be able to get over that fear, both sides have got their extremists. Trust me, I've met them on both sides. And they're not going to be happy with a one-state solution. And to say to Israelis that they should give up their state for the solution, which is about trusting, and to say to Palestinians that they should give up their goal of a single state, and to trust in the Israelis, who since 1948 have not treated them as equals, is a fundamental mistake. For whilst it is the ideal, it is simply not the reality of the region. And a lot of people might ask, why the 1967 borders? Why the Green Line? That feels fairly arbitrary. Why not go back to the 48 borders? Why not go back to the borders before that? Why on earth would we let British mandate Palestine that was written here in London, not here, in London, declare the future for these two countries? And yes, it is arbitrary, and I can't deny that. And there is really no theoretical basis for the Green Line, other than it is what the majority of Israelis and Palestinians will agree with. It has been the basis of all peace talks over the past 60 years, and it is the only solution that will ever be agreed upon by both sides, where they can trust that both sides are going to stick to it. And that is why it must remain. There's a fear of being a minority, and it's a fear that a lot of people won't understand. But for Palestinians and for Israelis, for two peoples who throughout history have been so persecuted, and that is why it is a great tragedy, this region, because the Palestinians and the Israelis could not have more in common. And that is why the situation is so tragic. And that is why they cannot trust each other to be a minority. It doesn't come down to making love. It's about a peaceful solution, one accepted by both sides, one that allows Palestinians and Israelis to wake up knowing that they have the protection that comes with a sovereign state. It is the only solution that is going to work, and I beg you to propose the motion.
I thank Joel for his speech, and I will not engage in the traditional practice of lambasting my successor, or in this case, Joanna's successor, and their sex life, because I think that demeans things, and people don't enjoy it, so I'm not going to do that. Thank you, Joel, for your speech. To open the case for the opposition is Baroness Tonge, formerly a Liberal Democrat MP for Richmond Park. She was made a life peer in 2005. She's outspoken about the Middle East and its issues, and has travelled to the region on many occasions. Baroness Tonge.
Gentlemen, to suggest that a two-state solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict is the only solution presents many problems for me, although there has been renewed optimism of late with the frantic efforts of John Kerry going in and out of the Middle East. Two states are certainly what a lot of people wanted, what I wanted, but the time has run out and the opportunity has been lost. John Kerry set a deadline for talks to resume at the end of June, well, maybe July as from yesterday, but with threats that after that time he'll cease his mediation effort. No sanctions, he just won't go there anymore. Precisely, it seems to me, what the Israeli government wants. Successive Israeli governments have never wanted a two-state solution. They want the whole of the land. The question,
How about the 2001 Oslo negotiations?
they didn't succeed. The question, ladies and gentlemen, is if Israel wanted a two-state solution, why isn't the one already? And why are they still building settlements all over the West Bank? 2 more approved today, 2 whole settlements. It's 60 years since the Nakba, which saw Palestinians driven from their homes and lands they had occupied for generations. 500 villages erased from the map. Many who resisted were killed. Many, yes, the Arabs did resist. As Ben-Gurion himself pointed out in 1955, and I quote, "If I were an Arab leader," he said, "I'd never make terms with Israel. We have taken their country. Sure, God promised it to us, but what is that to them?" That is Ben-Gurion, ladies and gentlemen. Of course, the Palestinians did make terms and signed off 78% of their land to Israel, but it was not enough. Since then, the so-called peace process towards a two-state solution has become an end in itself, a gag to silence people, a great sticking plaster to cover all the damage that's been done on once was called the Holy Land. And as many of you will know already, I'm not going to list the facts, but the facts on the ground now make it almost impossible to imagine how a state of Palestine could be recreated on roughly the 1967 borders with Jerusalem as its capital, East Jerusalem. Part of the Arab peace plan, revitalized recently, who have agreed to recognize the state of Israel. All of the Arab states will do that. Ignored by Israel. Now, you'll all be familiar with the facts on the ground, and I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, do you really think that Israel is going to move nearly 500,000 people back into Israel behind the Great Wall they've erected and allow the Palestinians to take over all of the towns and roads and infrastructure built at such cost for Israeli settlements, for Israeli settlers? It's such a quaint, innocent-sounding word, isn't it? Settlers. It's got a lovely ring to it. But the settlements are new towns with every amenity. One is soon to have its own university. It beggars belief that they will move all of this. And so, of course, they have no intention of doing so. I'd like to make progress, please, and I'll take an intervention later on. International 2 million, I missed a bit out, thank you. Eternal occupation was what Moshe Dayan called it. It's a policy, it's there, an end in itself. 2 million Palestinians in the West Bank being supported by aid from the international community, policed now by the Palestinian Authority, backed by more Western aid. Nice one, Israel. So you occupy a whole area of the Middle East, and you don't even pay for the illegal occupation of the West Bank or the consequences of the Gaza blockade. We pay, we in the West pay. International law is defied, the Geneva Conventions are flouted, and no one blinks. Consider then the other scenario of a one-state solution, which I think will have to happen. If only the Balfour Declaration had insisted that there must be no transfer of populations, no demolition of homes, if only UN resolutions had been obeyed, if only the Jewish people who moved there after the Second World War had determined to make their homeland amongst the Palestinians. If only.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you before.
After the UN resolution which formed the State of Israel, the leader of the Arab League said, if the Jews try to create any Zionist entity on this soil, we will drown them in their own blood. That does not sound like adhering to UN resolutions.
No, indeed, I agree, but I will refer you back to what Ben-Gurion said. And the reason was that the Palestinians had not been warned and they had not been consulted. They had no idea about the West's intentions for their future. If only they had known, things might have been different. But, ladies and gentlemen, a one-state solution may be forced upon the Israelis. The Middle East is changing rapidly. War is looming all over that region. Previously friendly states are no longer there. And who knows, one day, an energy self-sufficient USA may decide to abandon its weapon-testing aircraft carrier called Israel and concentrate on the Far East and the Pacific. What then would be the future for Israeli citizens? Many commentators are warning Israel, time is running out for the two-state solution. As long ago as 2007, Ehud Olmert warned Israel, 2007, if the day comes when the two-state solution collapses and we face a South African-style struggle for equal voting rights, then as soon as that happens, the state of Israel is finished. That's Olmert. Far better now to rethink the state of Israel. It's declared itself to be a democratic and Jewish state, which I think is an oxymoron. It can't be both. At present, non-Jewish residents of Israel are distinctly second-class citizens, and I can't go into the detail, but there are 40 differences in the rights they have compared with Jewish citizens of Israel. Any Jew from anywhere in the world, we know that, I can't take any more, can emigrate to Israel and become a citizen. No rights are given to Arab and Christian Palestinians who are driven out of their homes during the Nakba. They've no right of return. A one-state solution would be an apartheid state at first. Of course it would. And Israel could only remain the Jewish state of Israel if it drove as many Palestinians out as possible and treated the rest in the same way as native Africans were treated during the regime in South Africa. Do we really want this? Israel would become a pariah state. Boycotts and isolation would follow. They're already happening. Many people already see her as a pariah state. Public opinion poll in the UK this year has put Israel, along with North Korea, third behind Iran and Pakistan for a negative influence in the world and a threat to world peace. And look what happened at the UN when the Palestinians got their observer status. They got a huge amount of support. Israel, time is running out. But the silent majority in Israel and the Jewish diaspora worldwide might just call a halt to this outrage and insist on a democratic state of Israel with full rights and opportunities for all its citizens in Israel, in the West Bank, and in Gaza, with a right of return for some refugees should they demand it. They won't necessarily demand it. It will be in Israel's interest to do so, of course, because in a one-state scenario, the Arab Israelis would soon become a majority and demand change. The state of Israel could then become an example to the rest of the world. Just imagine, ladies and gentlemen, a multicultural society based on the fusion of two peoples who share the same ancestry and have lived in those lands for thousands of years. They could live together quite peacefully before the Second World War. Why not in the future? It's a dream, but it could come true. A two-state solution is by no means the only solution to this terrible situation for which we in the United Kingdom carry so much responsibility. I beg you oppose this motion and consider a one state of Israel for all its citizens.
Thank you, Baroness, for your speech. Considering there are so many points that members of the floor wish to raise, we will take a floor round now. Please, could I remind you to state your name and college before you speak? Please keep your speeches to a minimum of 1 minute, and please wait for a microphone until when you speak. So, are there any points that anyone would like to offer in proposition of the motion?
Austin Mahler, Trinity Hall. This is in response to something that Baroness Tonge just said, and that is in Syria right now we see countries, and this is not the first time we're seeing a country torn apart by Sunnis versus Shiites, each one feeling that the other cannot live in the same country. Now, the one thing both of these sides do seem to have in common is a sworn desire to, as one of the floor points put it, to see the Israelis drowned in their own blood. Now, if they're willing to tear apart their own countries on this basis, then putting everyone in the same country, I think the city on a hill you dream of is simply unrealistic and will only end in a city buried.
I do think it is very unhelpful to use terms like drowning in their own blood. For goodness sake, let us grow up about this. There are many, many Palestinians, and if you go to the West Bank and if you go to Gaza, there are people there who have no enmity towards Jewish people whatsoever. They just want a peaceful existence and a prosperous life like most people have got in Israel. And likewise, people in Israel feel the same way. Let's stop all this nonsense.
Are there any points in opposition of the motion? Yes. Just wait for a microphone, sorry.
I'm Arthur Morden. There's no surety that once the two-state solution is enacted, peace will eventually follow. In the absence of the factors that made the two-state solution in the case of Northern Ireland work, that is a powerful, united opposition, a genuine and stable economic status, and a significant and real international support. And they are all absent in the case of Palestine. Therefore, how on earth that would result in peace, or even in a genuine state that could survive wars.
I think Joel would just like to make a point, and then I'll come to the gentleman at the end.
There are 2 points in there I'd like to respond to. The first is on the issue of economic prosperity. The only way that Palestine is going to survive independently, and the only way it is going to be prosperous, and I agree, that is a precondition, is if it is its own sovereign state. Gaza will not be free until the blockade is lifted, and that will not be until it is a sovereign state. It is only through that that they will succeed. We know that when states become sovereign, they become a better place in which to invest, and we know that it is only then, when the government can run its own affairs, that the government will be able to gain prosperity for its people. And we know that most of the Middle East works through prosperity, and that is the only way that peace is going to be achieved. And on the issue of how we know there'll be peace between them, we don't. And the two-state solution is far from perfect. But what I can say is that relations between two sovereign states, even at times of war, are far better than being a minority in a state where you don't have your own military, you don't have your own individuals at the UN to defend you. And the way we know the international community will back it up, as Baroness Tonge said, is that 197 states, I believe, voted at the UN for Palestine. But they were voting there for a two-state solution. That is the consensus of the international community, and that is how we know they will support an independent Palestine.
Are there any points in abstention of the motion? This gentleman down here. Do we have a microphone? Can we have one of them sitting there? Someone sitting there.
Hi, I'm Marco from Queens. I feel like a point that both sides fail to address is how will we get to the solution you propose? So the two-state solution, great, but why would Israel ever relinquish the power it has on 4 million people? It's unclear. And the one-state solution, also great, but why would Israel ever relinquish the power it has on 4 million people? Great.
We'll take one more round of floor questions. Are there any other points in proposition of the motion? Gentleman at the end.
Of not growing up, Daniel Janner, Trinity Hall. But is it right that in 2010 you were sacked from your spokesman role because you made a false accusation about Israeli troops who'd been sent to Haiti after the earthquake to help, and you accused them of trafficking organs? Was that right? And is that growing up? And does that sort of comment help this difficult conflict?
I am absolutely delighted that you've raised this point. No, it is not true that I accused soldiers in the IDF of stealing organs. I was asked if I had any comment to make on rumors and things on the internet that were saying that this was happening in Haiti. My response was to congratulate the IDF for the tremendous response they had made to the Haiti earthquake. They were truly magnificent. They sent people out there immediately. They did a great job. And I added that if there was any doubt to dispel rumors spreading, they should have an inquiry to make sure that this wasn't happening. Now, that was based on, if you remember, some years previously in 2003, allegations were made about organs being taken from Palestinian prisoners. They were allegations, but nevertheless, they were never, it all rumbled on and rumbled on. And 2 months after I made that remark, And I certainly, I mean, as a doctor, who would ever dream that you could satisfactorily take organs from bodies that have been crushed in an earthquake? I mean, it's a complete nonsense. But a simple inquiry would have solved the matter. And 2 months later, in fact, a retired brigadier from the Israel Defense Force was actually arrested in northern Israel for being part of an organ trafficking ring. Not from Haiti, but there is this stuff floating in the ether going on about organ trafficking, and that's what it was all about. I used to be a doctor in the health service. If anyone accused my staff or any of my departments of anything, however minor, I would have an inquiry to see what has gone on, and that's all I asked for.
Thank you, Baroness. Are there any other points in opposition of the motion? Anywhere at all? None. Marvellous. Are there any points? Is one up there? No? No. Anyone else? No. Are there any points? We'll move on. Any points in abstention of the motion? Over there.
So this is an issue that obviously lots of people care about, and lots of people do deeply here tonight. But more than anything, it's an issue which is given far more airtime than it actually deserves. This sounds like a ridiculous thing to say, but we have people all over the world starving, and this is a strip of land which is much smaller than Sweden and has a population much less than Sweden. And the amount of time and effort and money which goes into it, when it could be going to solve problems which would help billions rather than the few million people who live in this area, would be much more worthwhile.
We will return to another floor round later on. It's now my pleasure to invite Professor Alan Johnson to speak for the proposition. Professor Johnson is editor of the quarterly journal Fathom, which argues for deeper understanding of Israel and the region. He is also a senior research fellow at BICOM, a senior research associate at the Foreign Policy Centre, and he blogs for The Telegraph and for World Affairs. Professor Johnson.
Thanks very much. I'd like to begin with a different question. What is the two-state solution a solution to? Ask yourself that question and answer it accurately, and I suggest you're a long way towards answering our question and to seeing why the two-state solution really is the only solution. The proposal to divide this narrow strip of land between the river and the sea into two states, Israel and Palestine, is a solution to three things. First, to the Palestinians' need for a state of their own in which to exercise their rights to national self-determination as a people. Secondly, to the right of the Jewish people to a homeland, a place in which to express their rights to national self-determination as a people. Third, to the brute and inescapable fact that both peoples seek to exercise their rights to national self-determination in the same land. It's the only solution because what we're looking at is not apartheid, but an unresolved national question. Unresolved because two peoples, both Europe's victims, by the way, are trapped in a tragic history which you can't undo, but you can work through. This is a conflict not of right against wrong, but of right against right. Two legitimate claims to the same land must be reconciled through mutual recognition, compromise, and the division of the land. The two-state solution is the only solution because it's the only way to reconcile those two legitimate claims. Because that's what any solution has to look like, the so-called one-state solution is no solution at all. When I'm debating the one-state solution, I'm reminded of that quip of George Orwell, which said that some ideas are so ridiculous you can only get the intellectuals to believe in them. If a solution means ending bloodshed, affording dignity, giving expression to national self-determination, to human and political rights, to economic and social opportunities to both peoples, then the phrase one-state solution is an oxymoron. The one-state solution isn't a solution because it denies the Palestinian people the right to self-determination. The one-state solution isn't a solution because it denies the Jewish people's right to self-determination. The one-state solution isn't a solution because it ignores history, ancient and more recent. It ignores ancient history. It turns away from a bloody reality of a century of bitter conflict in a kind of well-meaning John Lennon-esque spirit. Imagine there's no countries, man. As The Guardian's Jonathan Friedland put it, though, and he's a sharp critic of Israeli governments past and present, the one-state solution is rather like advising a couple that can no longer bear the sight of each other that the answer to their problems is for them to get married. The one-state solution ignores more recent history too. We've just lived through a real purple patch in terms of creating nation-states. They proliferated as the Soviet Union broke up, as Yugoslavia broke up, and for goodness sake, even those velvet underground-loving hipsters in Czechoslovakia decided that if it was okay with each other, they'd just separate into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And most of the people won't have a clue who the Velvet Underground are, so I'll just say you've got a real treat ahead in Spotify. Just go on check them out. The one-state solution gets wrong what the conflict is actually about. Two highly developed and distinct societies, Israeli and Palestinian, each based on a powerful sense of national identity, must divide the land. When there are such strong desires for national self-determination, the one-state idea collapses the world over. The fact that there's no one-state solution makes the two-state solution desirable. But is it viable, and is it just? Is it viable? Yes. The first reason for optimism is that the two peoples still support the two-state solution despite all. That's bedrock. The second reason for optimism is that the international community, with its diplomatic weight, its capacity to legitimize, and its material resources, fully supports the two-state solution. The US is again leading a major push for peace. Secretary John Kerry is talking to all parties to agree terms of reference for restarting talks. The European Union remains absolutely committed to the two-state solution. It's a major financial backer of the Palestinian nation-building project, which, despite its difficulties, has been very successful. The UN and the World Bank said it was on the verge of statehood. A political solution is necessary to take it further forward, but its significant progress has been made. Another reason for optimism is that the Arab League supports the two-state solution. The 2001 Arab Peace Initiative basically says Israel gets full recognition from the surrounding Arab states in return for two states on the 67 borders. This year it was renewed by the Arab foreign ministers, with John Kerry standing next to them, with one crucial amendment. For the first time, the Arab Peace Initiative now says we recognize the principle of land swaps. Land swaps I'll come back to. And the reason Israel hasn't said much to it, if you talk to Mark Regev and the people from the Prime Minister's office, is because it's going on behind the scenes. It's going on in negotiations at the moment. This matters hugely, this notion that the Arab Peace Initiative and the Arab surrounding states are now supportive. The Palestinians need that because they need the regional diplomatic cover to make the two-state deal. The Israelis need it because they need regional buy-in to take the immense security risks involved in making the two-state deal. Another reason for optimism, both leaders, Mahmoud Abbas and Benjamin Netanyahu, they're not born two-staters. Two states are not what they wake up every morning yearning for, but they are nonetheless now both reluctant two-staters. Mahmoud Abbas gave an interview to Channel 2 in Israel in 2012 in which he said, look, I want to go back to the village I was born in, Safed, but I know I can't go back there to live. I thought this was an enormously significant statement by Abbas. He declared that for him, Palestine is the West Bank and Gaza. Benjamin Netanyahu committed himself to a two-state solution in his Bar Ilan University speech in 2010. He reaffirmed that commitment during President Obama's recent visit. He said from the floor of the Knesset, he's ready to make a historic compromise to end the conflict. He says he has no intention of allowing Israel to drift into a binational state. He has put Zibi Livni, the two-stater, the loudest and most determined advocate of reaching a two-state deal, effective leader of the Israeli peace camp, as leading the negotiations with the Palestinians. When he spoke recently to directors at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he spoke openly about the need for Israel to reach a two-states for two peoples deal to avoid a drift into binationalism. Fifth reason for optimism, this might surprise people, how far we've come. If you focus just on the last few years, you can get demoralized. If you take a bigger section of time, look over the last 30, 40 years, we've come an enormous way. We've gone from it being a criminal offense to speak to the PLO to handshakes on the White House lawn between Israeli prime ministers and PLO chairmen. We've gone from the Palestinians refusing to recognize Israel to recognizing Israel. We've gone from the two-state solution being a fringe idea to it being the only real policy framework. supported across the spectrum, across enough of the spectrum to make it happen in Israel, Palestine, the Arab world, the US, and Europe. It isn't true to say that 20 years have produced nothing. Differences have been clarified, gaps have been narrowed, 2 major sets of negotiations have got us close to a deal, and another is in the offing. And just one word about the history. The idea that Israel has not tried to divide the land and wants all of the land is simply wrong. 1937, the Peel Commission, the Jews accept the principle of dividing the land, the Arabs oppose it. 1947, the United Nations Partition Plan. The Jews accept partition of the land, the Arabs oppose it. 1967, after a defensive war against Nasser, who threatened to drive the Jews into the sea, Israel's first response is to offer land for peace. The reaction from the Arabs at the Khartoum conference, no, no, no. Camp David, Barak's offer to the Palestinians to create 2 states, refused. Tabor in 2001, refused. Annapolis in 2007-8, in which Olmert offered 95% of the West Bank, plus 5% compensating land swaps, a shared capital in Jerusalem, and a land corridor connecting Gaza and the West Bank, and Abbas said the gaps are wide. It doesn't mean we can't make the solution, but the idea that Israel has not tried to divide the land is simply false. However, am I missing the central problem, which the Baroness raised, which is, haven't settlements killed the 2-state solution? Let me take that head on. No, settlements have not killed the 2-state solution, and here's why. 3 points. First point, 80% of the settlers live in large blocks close to the Green Line. To connect those blocks close to the Green Line up to Little Israel involves a land swap of about 6%. For which compensating quality land swaps would be given to a new Palestinian state. That is doable. That has been the basis of talks at Camp David and Annapolis. That's supported by Obama, the EU, and now the Arab League. Second point, 20% of the settlers live outside of those blocks along the hilltop. They will not be part of a new deal. Third point, 20 to 30,000 households need to be absorbed, not 500,000 people. Israel does absorption of new populations, it does disengagement, Sinai, southern Lebanon, Gaza, northern West Bank, and it does forcible disengagement when necessary. To finish on this, we need to say something else, though, we 2-staters. We need to acknowledge that it's not enough to say the 2-state solution is viable, we need to say is it just. It's as just as history is going to allow us to be. If you want absolute justice, you're going to get absolute paralysis and no peace. If we want to combine as much justice as we can give to the Palestinians and the Israelis, plus acknowledge the realities of where history has taken us, then the 2-state solution is the best we're going to get. The refugees will have to return to a new Palestinian state. They won't all be able to return to Israel. That threatens Israel's Jewish character. So to draw my comments to a conclusion, I'd say this. Let me dream a little bit at the end, a bit like the Baroness did. In time, after the national question's resolved, after the 2-state deal is done, after a generation or two have lived in peace, as Joel said, not in love, but in peace, then, yes, then the potential's enormous. Then we can work for free trade zones, porous borders, across which flow streams of economic activity and cultural activity. We could see those 2 states modeling a way of peacefully coexisting in a region bedeviled by conflict. We could see the Israeli President Shimon Peres's dream of a new Middle East. Possibly, perhaps. But all of that is on the far side of the 2-state solution. And that's another reason, if another reason were needed, why the 2-state solution is the only solution. Please propose the motion.
Thank you, Professor Johnson, for your speech. It's now my pleasure to call upon Professor Caroline Rooney to continue the case for the opposition. Professor Rooney is a professor of African and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Kent. She specializes in post-colonial studies and Arab cultural studies and is particularly interested in contemporary Arab writing. Professor Rooney.
As Alan Johnson indicated, it's a particularly timely debate, so thank you, Cambridge, for mounting it. I'll begin with an anecdote. I was recently in Israel, and when I was leaving from Ben Gurion Airport, an official came up to me and asked to see my passport. I handed it over, and she said, "It says you were born in Harare. Where's that?" So I said, "It's in Zimbabwe, in southern Africa." Then she said, "Why were you born in Harare?" I thought for a few moments and said, "Well, it's because my parents were settler colonialists. She looked at me as if I was an oddity, but waved me through saying, "You can go now." Well, I began with that anecdote because indeed I do come from a colonial settler background, and it's on that very basis that I'm in favor of an integration rather than a segregation, a one state rather than a two state. Although I think that there are things to be said for the two-state solution, I want to make the case for the one-state solution. Okay, well, segregation is based on a separatist ideology. And I think that separatism does not necessarily make for the best societies, in my experience. They tend to be societies that promote a principle of self-similarity, which can become very conformist. For example, I think of gated communities, and the settlements are very much like gated communities. They're kind of clones of each other. Well, I raise this because it's often said that a one-state solution is too assimilationist, but actually I think that it will make for a more creative society. And I have nothing against John Lennon. Okay, well, the reason for separatist societies is fear and distrust, understandably. But the problem with separatism is it actually generates further fear and distrust. The more you turn away and turn inwards, the more you fear attack. So my argument is that the best way to tackle security fears on an enduring long-term basis is through the one-state solution. As Israeli commentator Gideon Levy pointed out in Haaretz recently, an integrated state would cause the disintegration of external threats. Iran, Syria, Lebanon's Hezbollah, if it were a combined Palestinian and Israeli nation, would have much less reason to threaten it. Not only that, as Radakami's research has shown, there are Palestinians who would regard the two-state solution as just the first step to reclaiming what they see as their lost country. So the two-state solution would not absolve Israel in its partners from the necessity of, and I'm using a phrase of Mushi Dayan's here, living by the sword without end. Okay, well, the biggest objection to the one-state solution is that it would mean the end of Jewish nationalism. And I have... sorry. Yeah.
How would you propose to integrate the Alaska Martyrs Brigade, Hamas, and the IDF?
Well, this is what I'm kind of coming to, because I actually think that the combination of religion and nationalism is always potentially I say, irrational and potentially dangerous. It can lead to notions of sacred nation. It leads to problematic secularizations of religion. And I would say this is the case, be it sort of Islamist forms of nationalism or certain extreme forms of Jewish nationalism. Joel mentioned that, if I understood you correctly, that the extremists wouldn't accept a one-state solution. But I think that's the very reason why we should have it, because we need to challenge the extremists and try and tackle that. Yeah, so, well, it's usually argued that in the modern world, democracies privilege, citizenship over race and ethnicity, so that we shouldn't really be crediting forms of nationalism that we regard as rather anachronistic. This is usually made on the basis of multicultural secularism. I make it on the basis of a common humanity even if that makes me sound like one of these sort of flaky Tahrir Square people. I'm just picking up on illusions. I don't think there's anything flaky about Tahrir Square. But that said, for those of you who might be interested, there would be theological arguments you could make with respect to challenging the supremacy of religious nationalism. I just discovered recently a book in the Bible called the Book of Amos. I don't know if anyone here knows it, but Amos accuses the house of Israel of having betrayed the covenant, because he says it's a nation that is giving itself special privileges. And according to Amos, God is displeased because God is the God of all nations. So interestingly, Amos prophesies that the Israelites will be exiled, but he says they will be allowed to return and stay once they've learnt this lesson about God being the God of all nations. And he even says that, did I not bring Israel up from the land of Egypt, but also the Philistines from Capphor and the Syrians from Kir? He helps all those beleaguered. And similarly, you will find in the Quran similar appeals to multinationalism. The famous one is, God says, I've made you into nations and tribes that ye may know each other. Okay, well, the problem with the Holy Land that we just touched on earlier is that the Holy Land spelt H-O-L-Y has become the Holy Land spelt H-O-L-E-Y. The reason is that through segmentation, the West Bank has been turned into so many enclaves. Depending on your source, 161 Israeli settlements, or some say 130 settlements and many outposts. So there are all these settlements, but there's also the encircling of Palestinian villages and towns. It's likened to a Swiss cheese. So this fact on the ground does, and I agree with Baroness Tonge here, that mean that a two-state solution has become practically impossible if the Palestinians are not palmed off with an extremely piecemeal, miserly solution. And if they have been resistant to agree to previous offered solutions, it's because they've been incredibly, from their point of view, miserly. Some say that the one-state solution is too utopian. Why are we all ending our talks of dreams is an interesting thing to think about. But I would say that actually the one-state solution is the more realistic in many ways, particularly because it's a small country and there's a need to share resources. I mean, after all, Israel claims 80% of the water of the West Bank. There's a need to share these resources. But I will say that, yes, there is something utopian about the one-state solution, for sure. But then, Herzl, who is one of the earliest formulators of Zionism, in his novel Old New Land, Zionism began as a utopian dream. So I'll end with the last words of Herzl's novel, which are, all the deeds of men are only dreams at first, and in the end, their deeds dissolve into dreams. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rooney. We will now take another floor round. Please can I just remind you again to state your name and college, wait for a microphone, and keep your speeches to about a minute in length. Are there any speeches in favour of the motion? No one. Yes, we'll come back. I'll come back to you.
Albert Beardo, Christ College. Is this on?
If you press.
Is this on?
Have you pressed the button?
It is on. Is it working?
Yes, Albert, just carry on.
It is. Anyway, I just wanted to ask really, or challenge people to find me an example of a nation state today which has two peoples with very different cultural, ethnic, and historical backgrounds, which have come together to form one nation successfully, because without one side being overwhelmingly dominant in that relationship, or without an external power being overwhelmingly dominant. I mean, if you think of the large multicultural, multiracial societies today, most of them were formed either by a colonial power, think of the US, Brazil, India, or by an overwhelmingly dominant power, for example, in China. I can't really think of any where two peoples essentially came together and happily agreed to live together peacefully. And even where there was an external power imposing a single-state solution, just think of the Middle East, or even look at how difficult it is to create a coherent EU, or even look at countries like Belgium, which already seem to be falling apart. It's very difficult to bring two separate peoples together in a single state without one side having an overwhelming dominance. So I can't see a one-nation solution for Israel being anything other than having probably the Jewish side of the state being in an overwhelmingly dominant position.
I think Professor Rooney would like to come back on that point.
Well, picking up the theme of what I was saying earlier, I would say, well, how about South Africa? How about Zimbabwe? The establishment of a new society along these different lines is not a swift thing. And I know that if I mention the question of Zimbabwe, people say, oh, well, that there's been disasters there. But actually, there's been a kind of remarkable coming together in recent years that we don't hear much about. In fact, there was an article in Counterpunch about this just recently. It's a very exciting place to be because of this. And as Baroness Tonge was saying earlier, there's an amazing possibilities that can happen when people come together in this way. And once you get over the initial stages, the adjustments, the difficulties.
Are there any other points in opposition of the motion? Is there one upstairs? In opposition of the motion, so on this side, Nate's proposition. Anyone else? Yes.
Thanks. It's not really opposition, but I'm inclined to think that maybe before focusing on the political superstructure, it might be worth actually focusing on people's mindsets first. And the fact that any form of solution is so far away that it might be worth, firstly, seeking to... Well, I think the whole idea of a one-state solution is a bit ridiculous, given how Israel currently treats the Palestinians. Any form of one-state solution would need massive guarantees in terms of them having greater civil rights. So I think looking in terms of to try and encourage people to actually think in a more tolerant way, to encourage them to cultural projects and to expose people. And the fact is, we look for some sort of superstructure solution, but it probably isn't there. We've been looking for it for years, and it's probably not in the near future. I think in the short term, we should focus on what we look to actually be able to control, and that I think is in cultural interaction, and to just focus on getting both sides to understand what exactly it is that motivates the other side, that so to get Israelis to understand what the Palestinians want, to get the Palestinians to understand what the Israelis want. I think that at least is a path to progress, if not to the solution.
Are there any points in abstention of the motion?
Hi, Ali Roth, Downing College. I'd just like to question sort of the long-term solution of either of the models presented to us. It's like we've been given the two-state versus the one-state. I sort of see neither of these as being a long-term solution to the problem, especially as it is at the moment. Because in a two-state solution, you have each state believing that the other state's land is their own by right. So how does this actually provide any sort of long-term peace to the region? But then in a one-state solution, you've got this reliance on a democratic ability to produce peace within a nation. And a democratic ability, it works in this country because largely those of us who are unhappy with Conservatives being in government aren't going to go and object to every decision they make by rioting. If you have a religious divide within a country, a minority who believe that their religion is being infringed on by a small majority in government is going to take that infringement really badly and is going to lead to massive instability within the country itself. So I'd like to question both sides on how they think that either of their models is going to be a long-term solution to the problem that we face.
Could we take another point in proposition of the motion? Yes, the chap up there.
I just want to refer back to what Professor Rooney said at the near to the end of her speech. She said something about this being the one-state solution being based on utopian principles, but a solution based on utopian principles only would work in a place where a utopia exists. But the two-state solution actually takes this into consideration because people are always, or however much the government may say that we agree, the people themselves may not. They obviously have their own conflicts within themselves regarding that.
Thank you very much for that intervention. Are there any other points in opposition of the motion? Anyone in the gallery? Yes, over
there. I'd just like to ask Mr. Johnson whether he had any arguments for why the present government would be in favor of a two-state solution and not keep referring back to Olmert and other governments that came before Netanyahu's present government. And I should remind Mr. Johnson that Netanyahu belongs to the Likud party, and the Likud party is widely supported by a whole range of the Israeli population that is strongly against any two-state solution. The settlers, many of the settlers there included, and his coalition so far, both of his coalitions, because he's been re-elected, have been made up of known anti-two-statists.
Could I have your name and college, please? Sorry.
I'm Laurent from St. Edmunds.
Thank
you. It's by no means a perfect coalition, but there's a lot more room for optimism, I think, than you think there is. Surprising as it may sound to you, Netanyahu is currently the dove of the Likud. That's the truth of it. He has said he's for negotiations now without preconditions. He has committed himself to a two-state solution. He said he wants a conflict-ending, a compromise. That's true. Interestingly, in the coalition is a new political party called Yesh Atid. There is a future which is led by Yair Lapid, who said he's committed to the two-state solution. I've been in Israel recently talking to these people, talking to Dov Lippman and some of the people around his team. They say to me it is not just a cover, it is absolutely what they're committed to. It's one of their red lines. That's reason for optimism. Another reason for optimism is the Labour Party, which is currently outside the coalition. Shelley Yakimovich, the leader, has said, if you get traction in the peace process, we will join you in the Knesset to keep it going, and if necessary, if Naftali Bennett, who is the kind of person you're talking about, withdraws from the coalition, Labour will enter the governing coalition to sustain the talks. Hat Noir, the party of Zippy Livni, is absolutely fully behind the two-state solution. So it's mixed. I'm not saying, I'm not ignoring your question. It's not by any means obvious that this is a wholehearted two-state coalition, but I think there's enough there and enough to work with if there's political leadership. And I agree with you, it ultimately will come down to Netanyahu's political will and commitment to the process. My reading is that he reads it like many other Israeli politicians of left, right, and center, which says that if Israel does not make the deal, in time, it will have to make a choice between being Jewish and democratic. I think it's absolutely possible to be both. Nation-states have national minorities and then they deal with them. That's not a new phenomenon. But Israel needs to make the deal. And I think Netanyahu has said he understands that. I think that's the case. So I think there's some cause for optimism.
And the second question is, if that is the scenario in Israel as you just found it, why have they announced the building of 2 large settlements today, a long way from the Green Line? They're not ones that could be easily swapped. Why?
Can we just keep the remarks very brief? So.
Okay, I can't tell you what I'm on. To be serious for a second, inside the coalition there's a debate. Uzi Arieli, who's the housing minister, said recently the department is coiled like a spring, waiting to build more settlements when we get the go-ahead. The point is he hasn't got the go-ahead. The point is those people who really carry influence inside the coalition, Netanyahu and Lapid in particular, and Livni, have put a block on that. Now, John Kerry Obama's big mistake, and Obama and Clinton made a mess of the peace process, in my view. Obama's big mistake, which Abbas agrees with, was to say settlement freeze, complete and total 100% has to be where we start. It was never deliverable, and it created real paralysis in the process. John Kerry has said, and it looks like the Palestinians have accepted, it simply isn't possible to make that an absolute precondition. I agree with you. It's to do with politics. Again, it comes back to how you keep a coalition going, how you keep popular support for a project. And at the moment, to say a simple 100% no to every nursery as people grow, every school extension, every extension of a classroom is simply not realistic. If we can get past that and get into talks, then I think the actual agenda, as it was at Camp David, as it was at Tabor, as it was at Annapolis, is not settlement expansion. It's, as the deal was at Annapolis, 95% of the West Bank, plus land corridors, plus shared capitals, and so on. So that's the actual agenda. Getting there is what we need to do. And I think to hold up total 100% settlement freeze as the basis to get there is a political mistake. So.
Are there any other points in abstention of the motion?
James Bailey, Pembroke College. Working? Yay. Right. So there were, a couple of points I want to make. Clearly, it's an incredibly difficult proposition that either side of the House is bringing forwards. I'm particularly given, speaking almost from the point of view of a sort of history student, looking at whether such an ethnically based state as Israel is going to be viable in the very long term, is something which I think the opposition is right that Israel does have to think about. The other point I would make, which hasn't been made, is to what extent you can actually turn the current Palestinian territories, split as they are into 2, very different geographical blocks, whether you're actually ever going to be able to turn those into one state is a sort of additional question which I don't think either side has addressed fully yet. Because in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, there are significant differences now between the two of them, and one must wonder whether, in fact, a 2-state solution may not be the only solution, not necessarily because we should be looking at 1 state, but possibly because we should be looking at 3.
We'll take the final round, please. Could you keep your speeches to 1 minute, Michael? In proposition. He's been dying. He's been desperate for ages, so I thought I'd let him speak. I know.
Thanks, Alex. Is this thing working? Michael Dungokshan, Trinity College. So it would appear it is a great college. It would appear that this debate really comes down to 2 questions. Is the 2-state solution a solution, and do there exist any others? All right, question 1. It seems that there's broad consensus in the room that the 2-state solution probably is a solution. Indeed, we had concessions to that effect at the beginning of both Baroness Tonge's and Dr. Rooney's speeches. They both said there was a substantial case to be made for the 2-state solution. So then it would appear that the debate converges to the question of, is there another solution that is plausible? And this is where I think I come to the only thing in Professor Johnson's speech that I disagreed with. His quotation from George Orwell that if only intellectuals believe something, then it must be silly. The fact of the matter is that the only people who believe in the 1-state solution are not intellectuals. The most persuasive speakers in this debate are most conspicuous by their absence, namely the ethno-nationalist elements both of the Palestinian and Israeli camps. They hold antithetical notions of what that one state would look like. The question in this debate is, what would a state look like that reconciled those two notions? I don't think we've had a persuasive picture of that from the opposition yet, and that's why I think there's really no alternative but to vote proposition in this debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Are there any points in opposition? No. Professor Rooney.
That really there are a lot of intellectuals in favour of the one-state solution. You might like to, I think that perhaps the one who's most well-known in this respect is Edward Said. There's Rada Karmi, who would have been here if she could, and has written a brilliant book on the one-state solution. There's Ilan Pape at Exeter University. There's a lot there.
There are many, many Palestinians in the West Bank who would prefer a one-state solution.
The current figures are... a recent poll had 45% of Palestinians supporting the one state.
Right. Thank you very much for those interventions. A final intervention. Is there anyone who wished to make a speech in abstention of the motion? Made one already, but carry on.
I love this microphone. My name is Marco. So I think something that a lot of times, like people say, oh, the Israelis, the Palestinians, there's something that needs to be kept in account. There is one occupier and one occupying power in this story. And it's not like everybody is like jolly and want to make peace. There's one occupying power and one occupied. And so I think one thing that both sides haven't taken into account is that the two-state solution will not happen for the next 30 years. What might happen is that the occupation will encroach and encroach and encroach for the next 30 years. And so in that situation, the only possible solution, situation where we would have a one-state solution, would be a kind of Naftali Bennett-style one state of Israel, where every Palestinian would be given an ID card of the Israeli state. And so that would be the one-state solution that a lot of the Israeli right is going for. What is your position on this one-state solution, which is actually the most probable, because an Israel-Palestine is not in the balance of power of the world today, is not going to happen.
Thank you very much for that speech in abstention. We must move on because time is pressing. It now gives me great pleasure to call upon Alan Mendoza to close the case for the proposition. Alan is the co-founder and executive director of the Henry Jackson Society, which advocates promoting liberal democracy in Western foreign policy. A graduate of Gonville and Keyes, he is particularly interested in the Middle East. Alan.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I feel almost sorry to have broken up the emerging rapprochement on the front bench over there. I've seen some great comedic duets in my time, Morecambe and Wise, perhaps, Anton Deck. I knew what I'm going to say, or maybe Hale and Pace, but I think Tonge and Rooney are the new tour team that are going around the country, it seems. But as I rise to conclude the debate for the proposition, it seems to me there are quite two distinct sides to this argument. It didn't have to happen. There was a hint of it from the gentleman over there speaking about the three-state solution. We've had discussions on other points. It sort of came to me as a hunch that we'd end up on the one-state solution, and that is how it's ended up. And so there is a side of the House that supports national self-determination for the Palestinian and Israeli people on time-honored liberal and democratic principles. These principles have been established ever since the Enlightenment and have formed the backbone of the creation of the modern-day world. They were nobly enshrined in the foundation of first the League of Nations and latterly the United Nations. They remain as important today as when they were first posited as the basis of the international order. And this side of the House therefore favors two states for two peoples on the straightforward premise that their cultures, backgrounds, and religions are both beautiful but also distinct. They therefore need nation-states of their own to flourish, separate nation states, and that this can only be achieved via a two-state solution. A two-state solution that will be exposed to public discussion and acclamation. A two-state solution which will have been negotiated by both Israelis and Palestinians, and which will resolve all outstanding issues in that conflict, whether those be land, borders, refugees, security, or water. A two-state solutions whose detail will have received the stamp of local authority because of local endorsement, but also international authority because of the endorsement of the many members of the international community who support it. The UK, the EU, the US, Russia, even the Arab world. In short, the two-state solution is the only solution which stands a chance of succeeding because it is the only solution where, notwithstanding the very real difficulties of getting to the end point, all of the ingredients of success can be found in the recipe to create the finished article. And then there is the other side of the house, that side of the house. That side believes that national self-determination is irrelevant. I'm aware of the irony of what I'm about to say, given that they'll recoil from the thought. But in making their arguments tonight, they have shown that they are sympathizers with imperialism. For that side of the House believes that they know best, that they know better than all those countries internationally who have endorsed a two-state solution in various forms, including Arab and Muslim ones. In fact, and most importantly, that they know better than the peoples on the ground themselves. Because, ladies and gentlemen, both Palestinians and Israelis have repeatedly said, when asked through opinion polls and other similar devices, that they would like a two-state solution, that they would value a two-state solution, that they would make a two-state solution succeed. Yet that side won't give them that opportunity. For them, the wishes of the local populations mean nothing, and the future contours of Israel and Palestine can be drawn on the back of an envelope and imposed from far away, perhaps even, dare I say it, from the chamber of the Cambridge Union Society. Yes, sir.
Self-determination cards really on the problem underlying the point that they're making, which, as I see it, is basically that, as you say, we shouldn't be determining what's going on by an imperialist diktat from abroad, but then that's precisely what's going on at the moment, i.e., money funding Islamist extremism coming in from the Gulf, and then essentially the USA propping up what is, in reality, and completely American-backed neoconservative Israeli administration, i.e. self-determination can only happen if it's strengthened from abroad, and that's quite apart from the enormous problems in actually trying to, the democratic problems in either a consociational state or trying to get some sort of a meaningful plebiscite in Israel.
Well, it's a brave intervention, sir, but sadly a flawed one, for two reasons. In many ways, I wish the Arab world would take a more keen interest in the plight of the Palestinian people. But if you look at money transfers coming in from the Arab world, it doesn't exist. Who are the biggest givers of aid to the Palestinians? It's the European Union. Why? Because the Arab world doesn't deliver on its promises there. And on the Israeli side, it may have escaped your attention, but the Israeli economy is the star of the region when it comes down to it right now. The startup nation, all these factors, it's being sought out as a leader, an innovator around the world. The American input, yes, it's important, but it's steadily diminishing in terms of what's happening. More and more Israelis taking control of their own futures, and we hope Palestinians will do the same thing too. But does this talk I refer to of backroom deals and elitist settlements sound familiar, ladies and gentlemen? It should do, because we are currently facing the legacy of this precise problem in the Middle East today. A problem the other side of the House in this debate tonight wishes to impose upon Palestinians and Israelis. In the aftermath of the Arab Spring, we are witnessing the breakdown of a system of national boundaries and national construct created by so-called enlightened Westerners after the First World War that have sown the seeds of sectarian conflict in the region ever since. I do, of course, speak of the world created by Sir Mark Sykes and Charles-François Georges-Picot in their Sykes-Picot Agreement, a deal which saw the carve-up of the Middle East region after 1916, when the British and French foreign offices decided that religious, national, and tribal differences mattered far less than the neatness of border constructs that suited their purposes at the time. As a consequence, Sunnis and Shias were forced together in Iraq. Lebanon was created as an attempt to balance a complicated and unmanageable ethnic and religious mix. Syria was given to an imported king from the Arabian Peninsula who proved so unpopular he had to be given yet another new construct, Transjordan, as a consolation prize, and peoples like the Kurds were left stateless. All of this was enshrined in a system of League of Nations mandates over former Ottoman territories that the Allies subsequently captured. Its immediate effects were devastating for self-determination. Sykes-Picot meant that Alawites came to dominate Syria over Sunnis and Sunnis over Shias in Iraq, against the natural order of things when you consider population balances in those countries. They would have been better served with separate states, yet those did not suit British and French purposes. In non-Sykes-Picot states like Egypt, the British used their influence to play political groups off against one another. In each case, though the actors were different, the pattern was the same: discord, disquiet, and dissent. Ironically, given the topic we're discussing tonight, the only thing the British got right in the interwar period was recognizing that their Palestinian mandate had two legitimate claimants: its Arab inhabitants and its Jewish ones. The repeated attempts to marry these competing claims ended up being resolved in the only way it could be, as my colleague Alan Johnson said, with an offer of partition to create two states for two peoples. And let me remind you once again, ladies and gentlemen, this process for a two-state Israel and Palestine was put forward and indeed voted through by the United Nations in 1947. In that respect, what we on this side of the House are proposing is nothing more and nothing less than what was intended over a long period of time, and after careful consideration by the international community for both Israelis and Palestinians. Separate states for separate peoples, after all other options had been ruled unworkable and impracticable. To return to these now seems to be utter madness. And what has happened to that world of Sykes-Picot, a world in which ethnic and religious groups were pushed together by the whims of colonial masters in the vague hope that things would be all right on the night? Have things turned out to be peachy after all? You hardly need me to tell you they have not. Is Lebanon the model the opposition aspire to when they reject the two-state solution? A 15-year civil war and the current paralysis in government and lurch back into sectarian conflict, as well as the rise of the terrorist Hezbollah movement, suggests it is not. Maybe it's Iraq then. Sorry, surely not possible. Iraq exists in national terms today in name alone. Kurds have a statelet in the north, and Sunnis and Shias duke it out in the center and south of the country after massive bloodshed. It's very fashionable to state it was the invasion of Iraq that led to this outcome. And yes, while creating the conditions that allowed for chaos through a lack of planning, sadly, however, it was the behavior of those left in its wake that actually led to this happening. So it must be Syria that the opposition would like to hold up as its poster child for why a two-state solution is wrong and you can set up a state with artificial constructs. And that Mr. Assad, he's such a lovely man. His wife comes from Acton, don't you know? The fact that I don't need to continue my argument in this regard, because you all know what has happened there, merely confirms what a disaster has emerged from a process of bi- or tri-nationalism. That is a world that Sykes and Picot created, a Middle East purged of its religious and ethnic minorities, and where conflict and bloodshed are the norms, all in the pursuit of power within national boundaries created not to match what people on the ground needed, but what people very much like us in this chamber tonight, the educated elite, wanted. And for Sykes and Picot, then, read the opposition tonight. For they seek the same solution, the creation of an artificial construct in Israel-Palestine, a binational, tri-religious state which would collapse under its own contradictions were it to ever see the light of day, whose populations would inevitably be set at each other's throats within the unworkable framework established by outsiders. So you see, anything except for a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is simply nonsensical. It is certainly counter-historical. Those advocating it have obviously paid no heed to global history for the past century or more, which makes what they say in this regard truly jaw-dropping. So let me leave you with this thought, ladies and gentlemen. If you oppose this motion tonight, you will be ignoring the wishes of Israelis and Palestinians themselves. You will be ignoring the international community. You will be ignoring the Arab world. Worse than that, worse than all of that, you are condemning those peoples to a counter-historical fate that will lead not to peace, but to internecine conflict. In a week when we've discovered that sectarian conflict in nearby Syria, perpetrated by Mr. Assad, has now yielded 93,000 deaths, at the very least, I would not wish for that to be on my conscience. I hope you agree with me, and I beg you to support the motion. Thank you.
You tell me when it's 10 o'clock. Thank you very much, Alan, for your speech. It gives me great pleasure to call upon Ahmed Ali, who is originally from Egypt and a second-year medic at Fitzwilliam College, to close the debate for the opposition and the debate as a whole. Thank you. You tell me when it's 10 o'clock. You tell me when it's 10 o'clock.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to start by highlighting that I was only told about this yesterday, so I apologize if there's any sort of facts that I'm going to miss. But before I begin, I'd like to start with some points of rebuttal. The two-state solution, it seems to me it's promoted by politicians so thoroughly because, frankly, it does seem to be the quick, easy, lazy solution, as it were. To just, there's two people, they're not going to ever understand each other, let's just separate them apart. And why the people themselves in Palestine and Israel may seem to support it is, I believe, because they see the politicians reluctant. You see, the Palestinians themselves believe that all of that region is theirs, and the Jews believe that all of that region is theirs too. And so, if there is any agreement with the two-state solution, then I think it's because they see the people who make the decisions for them are too reluctant to actually do anything to bridge the gaps between the two cultures. And that leads me to another point of rebuttal. You brought up a lot of examples of where two cultures live together and have failed to work together. Now, I think in those countries, in those examples you stated, there were no attempts to bridge the gaps. And so it's a false statement to say that two very distinct cultures like that would not be able to coexist. And in fact, as Joel, you said yourself, these two cultures are far more similar than you think. They share so much, whether in a theological perspective or a cultural perspective. And so there is much ground and possibility to bridge the gap between these two people. Now on to my main speech. A sort of persistent principle that I will stand by here, and one that I think is important in proposing any plans, is the inherent equality of both groups of people here. There is absolutely no grounds for discrimination against either group. Some may argue that the Palestinians are not pro any kind of settlement or peace due to the existence of extremists amongst them, extremists who will go to great measures such as firing missiles, but there are plenty of Jewish extremists. And I was planning on giving you examples and names and incidents, but I think I don't want to appear like I'm criminalizing the Israelites, because I'm not. Both groups have their idiots, and both groups have a majority of people who want peace and prosperity in a land they hold sacred to themselves. Yet, despite that there are no grounds for discrimination, discrimination does occur. Israel, as has already been mentioned, has many laws that put Jews as inherently superior to any non-Jew. And if an Islamic state or a Palestinian state is formed, quite possibly it will become an Islamic state, and if not, will it really put, I mean, it's very natural that it will put the Palestinians as superior to any other non-Palestinians, and particularly to the Jews. It's not going to put them as equals. Is that going to be an environment that will cater to any peace between the two groups? I really do not think so. And so, someone in the, I can't remember, there are quite a few points thrown around and quite a few that I wanted to reply to. So, just generally I'm replying to you here. We do want a long-term solution, a constructive long-term solution, one that will lead to peace without much necessary intervention and regulation. And as was said up there, the only way I think this is going to be possible is if you actually do change the mentalities of the people there. You can set up laws, you can put armies to force people to behave in a certain way, but frankly, that's not going to lead to the long-term changes we want, which is peace in that region, some stability and coexistence between these two cultures. And that is only going to happen if both people are educated to see that they are both equal, that they are both capable of so much, that they both share so much in common. And the reason I stand against a two-state solution is because I don't think it caters to that. the simple fact that you will end up having two areas of localized sort of Arabs or Palestinians in the north and in the northwest and then sort of southeast, or vice versa, and then Jews in the middle, in my eyes, that's just going to cater to extremists. Extremists base a lot of their arguments on hearsay. And the people who listen to them, they have no way of verifying this hearsay because you don't see your opposition. You don't get to live and interact with your opposition. This country has benefited a lot by multiculturalism. People and many generations that may have had racist ideologies have passed away into history. Why? Because immigration happened. Yes, it did not happen suddenly, which would have caused many problems. It happened gradually, leading to many new people existing in this country, which led to the younger generation seeing for themselves that these other cultures are very similar to their own, that there is no ground for discrimination between these two cultures. Now, had they not actually met these people, had they not actually lived with other cultures, the hearsay of their ancestors, the racist talk of their parents and grandparents, would have been easily believed. And I think a two-state solution will cater to that kind of situation, where extremism will fester. And that's not what we want. Also, as someone mentioned in this end, the geography of it all. I mean, Gaza and the West Bank, how is that going to be one state? And how is that going to, in any way, cater to economic prosperity for the new Palestinian state? And actually, another point, with regards to the two-state solution, it's not viable long-term, simply because Israel will not sit back as the West Bank and Gaza develop economically. It will see it as a threat that either of them are becoming economically or militarily powerful. Go ahead.
Surely we'll recognize that it's in both states' interest to have peace in this region, and surely they'll both realize that the only way to achieve peace throughout this is when they're both economically prosperous. So why would it be in Israel's interest to slow down the Palestinian economy?
I don't see how they will see that. I don't see how the countries will realize that their only way to peace is when both of them are economically prosperous. It doesn't make sense. In fact, they'll see each other as economic. If both are economically prosperous, both have the chance of being militarily powerful. So actually, both are potentially a risk to each other. So it doesn't make sense to say that they'll want anything good for each other. So basically, as is evident, I'm proposing a one-state solution where bridges have to be built along the gaps between these two people. And it is very possible. And if we look back at history, admittedly I'm bringing up an ancient example and one that is not ideal, I acknowledge, but nevertheless important for my point, it's Spain when it was under Muslim rule for about 700 years. It was a culture that was the envy of all of Europe, a culture that is renowned for containing so much cooperation between Jews, Muslims, and Christians. So the cultures can cooperate. It's not like they are inherently against each other. And to just say, we'll just divide them, set two people aside, will, yes, as I said, lead to more extremism, but it's also the lazy solution. Since we've seen in the past that two cultures can coexist, why not try to aim for that now? That's the longer-term solution that will work. Two people living side by side who acknowledge each other as equals and will respect each other's cultures. That, I think, is a more peaceful long-term solution. Yes, it's idealistic, but since in the ancient world where there wasn't the technology, the communication, the knowledge we have today, they were able to have a culture where the two communities coexisted together. Why can't we do it in the modern world? No, thank you. So, what would I be proposing as a final solution? That's a lot of pressure for a medical student, considering I don't have any background in politics, but I think the ideal would be one state. And this one state would have a constitution that classes all groups as equal. And to have the symbolism of this state to be specific to one religion would be wrong. Considering that population-wise, the whole territory, West Bank, Gaza, and Israel together, the populations are approximately 7.5 million Jews and approximately 5.5 million Arabs. That's quite close to a 50-50 divide. And so to have one or the other religion or ideology dominating the symbolism would not help in what I'm proposing here. Go ahead. But what I've been saying for the last few minutes is that that is going to be a perfect environment for extremism and for further conflict between the two ideologies, whereas a one-state solution will allow for integration between the two ideologies and the development of a longer-term peace, where the two cultures acknowledge each other and want to coexist with each other peacefully. And let me highlight that this idea is a very idealistic one. I acknowledge it is very difficult. I acknowledge that if it was to happen, it would take at least maybe 100 years. But the difficulty of it, I think it is worth going through, because the plan itself appears, in my eyes, that it will lead to a very long-term solution, and a very long-term peace for the people. And it's not going to happen by suddenly having all the Palestinians move into the center of Israel. It's going to happen by having a regulated diffusion of the Palestinians from the two territories that they are localized in now into Israel over time. And governments will have to intervene to attempt to bridge the gap between these two cultures. And in doing so, eventually you will lead to one nation where one group of people see each other as, yes, having their different theologies, or maybe some differences in their culture, but eventually will be one nationalistic identity and one culture eventually, considering how similar they are already. And in doing that, you will have a long-term peace solution in the region. And thank you.
Thank you for concluding the debate, and thank you to all our speakers for participating in the debate. Just before Baroness Tonge and Professor Rooney have to leave very quickly, but as they are walking out, I'll just give you a few reminders about what's happening at the Union this week. Tomorrow we have our garden party, and Lisa Kudrow, the actress from Friends, and Neil Gaiman, the author and cartoonist, will be appearing on Saturday. There are also Union elections on Monday. The doors through which you vote are significant: ayes to the right, noes to the left, abstentions down the middle, and results will be announced in 15 minutes in the bar. Thank you very much.